you're going to learn about one of the most famous scientists of all time, the naturalist Charles Darwin. If you've ever heard of the origin of species, or evolution, or natural selection, you probably already know a little bit about this topic. Before we get into the lesson, there are some key terms you should know. Hypothesis, a scientific explanation for something that happens. Then we have a theory, which is created when hypotheses have been tested through experiments and observations. Then we have biodiversity, which is how diverse life is. Then we have evolution, which is how whole groups of species change over time. And natural selection, which is how species with the best adaptations to their surroundings tend to be the most successful and pass on their genes to new generations. Now, back to the lesson. Darwin was an English voyager who sailed on a ship called the HMS Beagle starting in the early to mid-1800s. This coincided with the Victorian era, in which Britain was trying to conquer many countries in an attempt to gain more resources and control. Queen Victoria, the Queen of Britain at the time, was the granddaughter of King George III, who was the king mentioned in the play Hamilton. So back to Darwin. So he's under Queen Victoria's rule with a mission to go out and observe what else the world has outside of Europe. A lot of his travels are focused in South America, but he did make it all the way around the world from 1831 to 1836. When Darwin was a young man, there were a few main theories about the world going around that broke away from traditional teachings. First, geologists suggested that the Earth was extremely old and ever-changing. Secondly, biologists theorized that life was also ever-changing. On Darwin's adventures, he developed something called the theory of evolution. Evolution is when a species, like a certain type of plant or animal or even human, develops new or different characteristics over time via natural selection. It was important that he discovered this information because we now use it to understand antibiotic resistance, COVID-19 strain emergence, etc. As Darwin traveled around the world, he made a lot of observations before coming to his conclusions about diversity. They are 1. That species are different worldwide, 2. That species are different locally, and 3. That species differ over time. He realized that species were different worldwide when observing rabbits and a few other species. Rabbits, for example, live in different habitats throughout the world, have different coats, different methods of feeding and finding shelter. He realized that species were different locally when he was on the Galapagos Islands and noticed all of the different types of tortoises that lived on the islands. He also noticed this about the finches, which would become a famous example of natural selection. He also realized that species changed and became different over time. He studied fossils and found that he can make distinct connections between current animals and their ancestors based on anatomy. In conclusion, Darwin was able to develop his theory of evolution because of his journeys on the HMS Beagle. Along the way, he was able to observe all sorts of life forms and make connections that others had not been able to before. Check out these sources for more information.